Plague Tale Innocence is a game that handles some pretty dark themes, and that's even before you get to the history. It also deals with some of the most horrific aspects of 14th century life, religious inquisitions, the 100 Years' War, and of course, the Black Death. I think this is a game set in the worst time to be alive ever. So let's dive into the world of Plague, War and Inquisitions and see if that claim stacks up. The story begins in rural Aquitaine, southern France, in the autumn of 1348. We play as Amicia de Rune, a young girl of noble descent. Amicia lives on her family estate, where her mother is trying to cure her sickly younger brother Hugo.
It's me, your sister?
Everything's going swimmingly, until one day in the woods, she comes across a supernatural power that eats her dog.
My dog!
And upon returning home, she finds the Inquisition have arrived.
Hugo, come here.
What's happening?
Shh.
I know you're here, kid.
Just keep running. Take a deep breath. Jump!
She escapes with her brother, and the two of them must travel across war-torn, plague-infested France looking for sanctuary and help for Hugo's illness. One of the first obstacles our heroes encounter is a plague-ridden village.
Come back here. That means there are sick people in these houses. Don't touch anything.
Oh, they're not allowed to go outside.
It's more serious than that. It means...
The Black Death arrived in southern France, as the game portrays, in 1348, but it had by that point already travelled across to Europe from Central Asia. At the siege of Kaffa, Crimea, in 1347, the attacking Mongol army, themselves suffering from the Black Death, launched infected corpses over the walls of the city to hasten the surrender of the garrison. And once it had reached Europe, the Black Death quickly spread inland. The plague was transmitted to humans from the bites of infected fleas. The bacterium that caused the disease, Yersinia pestis, lived in and blocked their guts. When a flea attempted to feed from an uninfected host, it regurgitated the bacteria into the open wound. After you were bitten, it would take around 6 days for the telltale buboes, the swellings, to appear. They were accompanied by violent fever and pain, and the immune system would have been totally overwhelmed, leading to death within a week. If the disease reached your lungs, you would die after just a few days of bloody coughing, and anyone unfortunate enough to breathe in even the smallest amount of mucus would themselves be doomed to the same fate.
Excuse me, please wait. Madam? What's the matter with them?
They look scared.
Here's the account of Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through the plague as it ravaged Florence in 1348. Brother abandoned brother, and very often the wife her husband. What is even worse and nearly incredible is that fathers and mothers refused to see and tend their children, as if they had not been theirs.
Was attacked. I'm begging you, please help us.
And the horror of the plague in Europe wasn't only caused by bacteria. Religious minorities and foreigners were often scapegoated, blamed for causing or spreading the disease.
This is the last village you'll infect.
In Strasbourg in 1349, on Valentine's Day, hundreds, maybe even thousands of Jews were burnt to death before the plague had even reached the city. As the game dramatically portrays, the Black Death decimated villages, towns, and entire communities, killing about half the population of Europe. In the worst-struck settlements, the dead and dying littered the streets and were often buried in mass graves. Consecrated ground was either full, or there wasn't the labour to bury everyone in the traditional way. Looking for help, the pair come across a decimated monastery, where they have their first encounter with the rats. The instantly deadly, man-eating rats. You gotta love them. It's interesting that rats are the embodiment of the plague in the game. The disease is even referred to as the bite. It was thought for a long time that the infected fleas that caused the Black Death lived in the fur of black rats, and therefore rats got the blame for spreading the disease by carrying the fleas. But it's now thought that the plague spread too quickly for it to be carried by rats, and instead the fleas simply jumped from human to human. In the Middle Ages, rats wouldn't have been suspected of spreading the disease at all. In fact, no one knew how it was spread. The best theory was a miasma, foul air, and one supposed cure was to live in a sewer, The idea being the clean but plaguey air from outside wouldn't be able to penetrate the foul smells of the sewer. Good luck with that one. Other cures included sitting by a roaring fire to sweat out the disease, drinking vinegar, or rubbing onions, cut up snakes or pigeons onto the buboes. Who is coming up with this stuff? We're off to a pretty rough start with the plague, but next on the list is war. Amicia and Hugo, who have survived the plague-ridden town and monastery, team up with Lucas, an alchemist's apprentice. The three carry on together.
Hey look, I'm a knight.
An English shield. Where did you find that?
Over there, lying on the ground.
Listen, Hugo. Put that down. It's not for
In
children.
a playtale, Aquitaine is being invaded by English soldiers, and Chapter 5 provides some of the most cinematic, atmospheric, and memorable moments in the game, as our heroes are forced to traverse a recent battlefield, all whilst avoiding enemy soldiers. And the rats.
Oh no! The rats!
The conflict that provides the backdrop for the game is the 100 Years' War, which lasted from 1337 to 1453. The mathematically talented will have noticed that's actually 116 years. It was fought by the French and the English over the right to rule the Kingdom of France, and interestingly, at the time the game is set in 1348, Aquitaine in South France was actually owned by the English. This was a consequence of the Duchess of Aquitaine, Eleanor of Aquitaine, annulling her marriage to the King of France and marrying the future Henry II of England in 1152. When Henry came to the throne, Aquitaine became an English vassal. By the early 14th century, the English crown had begun appointing Englishmen to key positions in Aquitaine. It was basically an English colony. They also sent large numbers of English and Welsh soldiers to Aquitaine to serve in the garrisons. And so, the world of a playtale in this aspect is a bit topsy-turvy. In theory, Amicia and Hugo should be avoiding invading French soldiers. And to nitpick even more, the 100 Years' War had a break during the Black Death. There weren't any major battles after the Siege of Calais in 1347 until the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. But if video games were perfectly historically accurate, they'd be boring. What's more important is that they give us a feel for the historical era in which they're set, and a playtale certainly does that with the 100 Years' War.
These are our boys. They gave their lives for England. What if it were you? You'd want a decent burial, wouldn't you? Wouldn't you?
It was, even by medieval standards, a particularly grueling conflict, especially in the area around Aquitaine. To give an example, an English army of around 6,000 soldiers destroyed 500 settlements and devastated up to 18,000 square kilometres of land in 1355.
Amicia, do we have to walk on them?
And here's a French account of the aftermath of the Battle of Agincourt. There in the dung, without a bed, were the dead sleeping, one on top of the other, in piles, heaps, some lying upwards, some face down. Amicia and Hugo survive the horrors of the Plague and the 100 Years' War, but they can't escape the Inquisition. In the game, it's their biggest foe. Grand Inquisitor Vitalis Bevenant is after the supernatural power that runs in Hugo's blood, and his troops are a constant threat throughout the game. It's only by confronting the Inquisition that Amicia and Hugo will be free.
Good job. He won't be getting up anytime soon.
And so, with the help of Roderick, a blacksmith's son, they close in on the Grand Inquisitor.
The bells, the cathedral, Amicia. That's where Vitalis is.
Inquisitions were an attempt by the Catholic Church to combat what it saw as heresy, namely any religious group that was non-Catholic. They began in 12th century France, of all places. I know, how fitting. In 1184, Pope Lucius III sent bishops to southern France to subdue a religious minority called the Cathars. We'll come back to them a bit later. By the time a playtale is set in the 14th century, Inquisitions had become widespread. In the early 14th century, a Dominican friar called Bernard Gui wrote an influential guidebook for inquisitors called Conduct of the Inquisition into Heretical Depravity. That sounds like a ripping read. A copy can be found in-game just before you confront Vitalis.
The Inquisitor's manual.
Are you serious? There's actually a manual for this
Indeed there is. The book details the types and nature of heresy and outlines how inquisitors should conduct interrogations and hand out punishments. Typically, an inquisitor would arrive in a town and announce their presence, thus giving the populace a chance to admit their own guilt. That's nice of them, isn't it? Those who confessed received a punishment that ranged from being forced to go on a pilgrimage to whipping. Those who refused to confess were first tortured and eventually would be sentenced to death, most commonly being burnt at the stake. The great amount of power that inquisitors were given led to corruption and abuse, although you can definitely say that even by medieval standards, Vitalis is running a particularly brutal and militaristic inquisition.
Very good.
Cruelty and sadism turned up to 11. But Vitalis is eventually excommunicated.
You are to be excommunicated.
And let's not forget there's a lot of supernatural stuff going on in the last third of the game, so it's not exactly historical realism. Plus he uses hypodermic needles that weren't really invented until the 17th century. Perhaps a historical precedent for such brutality can be found in the origins of the Inquisition, and this is where we come back to the Cathars. In the early 13th century, they were such a threat to the power of the Catholic Church that a crusade was waged against them in their stronghold in southern France. In 1209, around 10,000 troops were led south by a Cistercian abbot, a guy called Arnaud Amaury, best known for his orders at the siege of Breziers. Kill them all. God will know his own. Sounds like a nice chap. The crusade carried on for 20 years, after which a series of inquisitions were held. In 1244, a massacre of 200 Cathars was perpetrated by the troops of the Archbishop of Narbonne. Further inquisitions followed over the next 100 years until all known remnants of Catharism were completely extinguished. There were basically none left by 1350. It's thought the crusade killed at least 200,000, maybe even 1 million of them. I mentioned the Cathar Crusade not only to show how brutal an Inquisition could be, but also because it had a key role in the creation and institutionalization of subsequent medieval Inquisitions. Vitalis Bevenant has a few role models to be inspired by. Talking of Vitalis, Amicia and Hugo fight their way through to the church, and with Lucas and a thief called Melly, team up to take him down.
Shut up, you old fool! We're here to kill you, not listen to your speeches!
Hugo uses his supernatural power to control the rats. Yep, although Vitalis has a rat army of his own. There's then a wildly ahistorical boss fight, which results in Vitalis' downfall. Plague, war and the Inquisition all survived, but maybe at a cost. Historically, these three didn't really occur all at the same time and in the same place, but that's the world, basically the world of the 14th century, A Plague Tale evokes, and that's what makes it, I think, a game set in the worst time to be alive ever. And that's just the history, it's excluding all the supernatural stuff. In the game's epilogue, we see Amicia and Hugo walking through a bustling village. The world has returned to some kind of normality. Our heroes, free to continue their lives.
Then on 3. 1, 2,
3!
hey!
Coming up against 3 historical horrors all at the same time? That's one hell of an ordeal.
Alright, you won.
And provides the immersive backdrop for a fantastic game.